All right, good evening. Let's get started. We have to catch up, but it's actually a couple of fast Amudim. We're going to get close to the bottom of Kuf Gimel Amud Beis, hopefully to the Mishnah if time allows, but I haven't davened yet, so the 9:30 Marib is beckoning. We're starting at a Mishnah at the bottom of Kuf Beis Amud Aleph, at a fresh Mishnah. Hamaskir bais lechavero l'shana. Let's say I rent you my house, and what we agreed to was a year, but then the local Bezdin was Nisabra Hashana, who is the beneficiary of that extra month. So in this case, you agreed with me based on the terms, I agreed with you based on the terms of a year. So Nisabra Lisocher, the benefit of that extra month goes to the renter, and he doesn't have to pay anymore, to baker's dozen. And he gets that 13th month for free. Hiskir lo lechadoshim, if I rent you on a monthly basis, and Nisabra Hashana, then Nisabra Lamaskir, then if I own the house, I can charge you. We have a monthly rental agreement. What's the chiddush? Absolutely. The Gemara doesn't even get
12. If we say 12 months.
No. Wait, 12 months is 12 months.
The rent's $1,000 a month.
Yeah, it just says hiskir lo lechadashim. You're on a monthly. It doesn't sound like much of a chiddush. It's true. The Gemara doesn't discuss it, but it doesn't sound like much of a chiddush.
Based on the Rashi here, lo yar below poskar kodesh doesn't mean he gets kicked out or not kicked out. It means that he pay. If I rent a place for
no, nisabra lesocher is in the first day. It's in the first day.
I pay monthly, right?
Yeah.
I don't have to pay that 13th month. It's literally a.
That's the first din.
Yeah.
Nisabra
So similar. The second one is where it's month to where you're
paying monthly.
paying.
Your agreement was you're month to
Right,
month.
you're monthly
Yeah.
payer, you're not paying for the year.
So then what?
Like you said, agreement.
Oh, okay, fine. All right, good.
It's the first I disagree, but.
Oh, okay, fine. Yeah.
So you could be with yourself.
Yeah, he's having his own conversation. We are along for the ride. This is what's happening here. Please stop interrupting, David. We got to get a camera on this guy. Okay. And then the Mishnah continues with a story, and the story seems to not make any sense. Ma'aseh b'tzipori. All right, we see both here. I'm renting for a year for 12. And it's also Midinar Zav L'Chodesh. So there's a reference to both year and month in the contract. And then turning to the top of Kuf Beis, they get to split the 13th month in value. Namely, the Socher would just pay half the rent for that last month. Not a bad deal. Says the Gemara, Ma'aseh. Your story is a stira. In the Reish of the Mishnah, we pointed out there's only two iterations. There's either that we rented by year, and therefore the baker's dozen goes to the socher. He gets the extra month for free because it's not my fault that it became an ibrior. I didn't decide that. And the other option was that no, we rented monthly and then it became an ibrior. So then obviously that there's no reason why the masker should lose. Yet the story told the story of Yachloku. That's the story told. That's where you split. So the Gemara says, 3 lines down, 4 lines down. Amar lo, if the Mishnah says, if the language was Bishnei Masar Zehuvim L'Shana, Midinar Zav L'Chodesh Yachloku. Only when we have language that's both Shana-oriented language and monthly oriented. Let's just put it into English. You may rent my house for a year, followed by the next sentence, at the rate of $1,000 per month. So when you have the duality, the year plus the Chodesh, and then we find out that it's an Ibrior, then it's Yachloku, because the mindset we could easily see from both perspectives. Mamana multiple suffix, Cholken. Same idea. So says the Gemara. This is just the rest of the story. No problem. Clean Mishnah. We thought it was messy. It's not. There are 3 options. There is the option that the socher doesn't have to pay. There's an option that the socher does have to pay. And then there's the option that it's yachloku. Those are the 3 options of our Mishnah. But Rav doesn't agree with this. This is amazing. Rav is an Amora. Sometimes he's Rav Tanun Palik. Rav is functioning as an Amora. Amar Rav, had I been there, I would have given everything to the maskir. It's amazing. In which case, this is the 3rd case, the Maisa case. So there, what was the language? My Kamashman, what are you trying to teach us? That Taf was Lashon Achron? Why would he have given it all to the maskir? What was the Lashon Achron? There were 2 parts of the language of the contract. You can rent from me for the whole year. And then remember, part 2, while paying me $1,000 a month. So the Lashon Achron is purely a Chodesh language. So the Gemara says that Rav, when we have a two-part statement, it seems that Rav always follows the second part of the statement. The first part of the statement was, you can hereby rent my house for 1 year. And part two was at the rate of $1,000 per month. So if Rav is saying that the money should go to the maskir, then that means that Rav holds that we follow the principle of Tafus Lashon Achron, that when there is a two-part sentence, we always listen to the second part. So, but says the Gemara, if that's what Rav is coming to teach us, that's a waste of breath. Ha'amr Rav Chadazimna. Rav already taught this din. Where is this? To Amr Rav Huna. Amre Be Rav. They said, Rav Huna said in the name of Rav, that if a person said two different numbers, Istira, Ma'a, Istira, and Mea Ma'e, an Istira turns out to be 96, let's call it coins, and Mea Ma'e is 100 coins. So what if you said two languages? You said 96 followed by 100. So then which one counts? The latter one counts. Mea Ma'e. If you say 96, then the second one, that's the same thing as Lashon Achron Tofes. And or the opposite's also true. That if you say Mea Ma'e Istira, if I were to first say Mea Mai, and then I'd say Istira, the next coinage, 100 versus 96, then we follow the latter again, Istira. So why would Rav repeat himself? Why is Rav piping up to show us a shita about him that we already know? We know that Rav holds that when you have a two-part sentence, he always follows the second part of the sentence. So why are we wasting our breath? Says the Gemara, Rav says, Ime Hasam, third of the way down on Kuf Beis and Beis, if they were to only have had the source the other source that we saw, then Havamina Prusha Kamafarish. I might have thought that when it says Istira and Mea Ma'e, that if there's a really, really high level of Istira, then it's the same value of Mea Ma'e. We're not going to get into that sugya, but the point is that that's not a good raya, because perhaps when we said Istira, it meant Mea Ma'e and vice versa. Kamash Malan, that's not what it means, and therefore Rav is in the clear. Ushmuel, Amar Shmuel gives a different answer. Why do we say Yachloku? That's a beautiful Rashi over here, halfway down on the page. Rashi says, Ushmuel Amar, Mas Nisan Detani Yachloku, back in the Gemara, when our Mishnah says Yachloku, why did it say Yachloku? Not because of what Rav said, not because of what Rav said that Tafus Lashon Achron, but rather, Bibaba Emsa Chodesh Askinan. When did this happen? He came halfway through that 13th month. That's not fair, because then the Socher didn't have a chance to leave. Aval, had it been that the maskir showed up before the 13th month and said, hey, this month is an Iber Yor, it's really not the 13th month, it's really Adar Beis. He shows up by Adar Beis and says, Iber Yor, so you have to decide what you want to become there, then Kula the maskir, then the money for sure goes to the maskir. But Besov Chodesh, it becomes at the end of the month, the last day of that extra month, then Kulei Lissocher. And the Gemara has a problem with this because it implies that Shmuel doesn't agree with Rav. Rav said that the reason why the money, why he would have argued at least, that he wanted to argue against our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said Yachloku, a two-part sentence. He said it should be Yachloku, but Rav disagreed. Why? Because Rav holds that we're Tofes Lashon Achron. And then Shmuel gave a different answer, which implies about Shmuel that Shmuel doesn't hold Lashon Tofes Achron. So says the Gemara halfway down, Mi Amar Shmuel lo amrina Tofes Lashon Achron. Does Shmuel not hold of the principle of Tafas Lashon Achron? After all, we have a din where both Rav and Shmuel agree. Rav and Shmuel Damrei Tarvayu, they both agree. In regards to selling wheat, if I say to you, Kur b'shloshim ani mocher lach, I'm selling you a kur's worth of wheat for 30, so then the halacha is that the mocher can is yachol lachzar bo afilu b'sachrona. Then even as I start taking one saw at a time, as the mocher, you can back out. However, if my language had two parts instead of one, remember that's what our case of Tafas Lashon Achron is. If we say Kur b'shloshim sa b'sela ani mocher, it's kur b'shloshim, but it's also sa'a b'sela, that each sa'a is a sela. It's not just kur b'shloshim, but also sa'a b'sela. So then rishon kana. Every one that the mocher hands over to the buyer, to the lokech, done, the transaction is done. And what do we see over here? That in this latter case of kur b'shloshim sa'a b'sela, that even Shmuel holds that we follow tafos lashon achra. Why do we see that? Because he says rishon kana, which means that he's utilizing the second half of the sentence of sa'a b'sela. The haraya that Shmuel does hold of the principle of lashon achron tofes. Says the Gemara, the cases are not the same. 2/3 of the way down, hasam time amayim mishum de tofis. Over there, the reason why, in regards to the wheat, where we had the two-part sentence, first was kur b'shloshim, second was sa b'sela. Over there, sa b'sela, if I'm selling to you, you already have the sa in your hand. So therefore, it's toughies. Therefore, the transaction clicks, and you're not allowed to undo that. You can't go back on that. Hachanami, if you're halfway through the month, says Rav Nachman, Not Rav Nachman, that's the next answer, sorry. Here says the Gemara on behalf of Shmuel. Hachanami says the Gemara Katafis. It's ki'ilu, you've grabbed some of that apartment because you've been living in it. And if you're sitting in the apartment, it's as if you every day you pulled a little bit. So then you have to say, Achloka, what are you supposed to do? Whatever, let's call it per diem, whatever, prorated so that it makes sense. Let's say it's $3,000 a month, $100 a day, you're there for 10 days, $1,000. That's just, you were told-face already, you grabbed it already. Rav Nachman Amar. Rav Nachman says, Karka bechezkas be'aleha kayemes. Karka always is in the rishus of the Bailim. So says the Gemara, this aligns very well with another shita we saw. My kamashmalan, are you too trying to say tafos lashon achron? Are you trying to say in our case that the money goes to the Bailim, the money goes to the maskir? That's also tafos lashon achron. Pasha. So says the Gemara, Hainu Rab. The Gemara says, no, Rav Nachman's shita is different. Afal gav the apich mepach. Even if the two phrases were reversed, where the chodesh was put first and the year was put second, Rav Nachman would still say that the money goes to the maskir. His principle is not the principle of lashon achron tofes. His principle is just that we follow the maskir. All right, let's move on to a connected sugya. 8-9 lines from the bottom of Kuf Beis and Mid Beis, making good headway. In Metzia Hashem, we're going to finish the parak. And then move on to the next one for tonight. Let's go. Bo minei Reb Yanai. There was a shaila that was asked from Reb Yanai. Socher Amar, if the renter said, Nosati, I already paid you for this month. Maskir Omer lo natalti, and the landlord said, I never got the money. Al mi lahavi raya. Who is supposed to bring this? It was like when I lived in the Heights. My brother, Avi, grandfathered a little bit of an apartment there, rent controlled, very inexpensive. Okay, we paid our rent on time. Not everybody else did. So you saw sometimes a machlokes between the landlord Israel and some of the tenants who were not so good on their payments. But if you have a taina that if I'm the socher and I say, look, Israel, I paid you already, and you say, and Israel says, no, I didn't pay you. So who has the burden of responsibility, right? So the Gemara says, Amos, wait 1 second. When is this taking place? If it's within the month, we know that ein l'schirus elu levasof. We know that schirus in halacha, you're not obligated to pay until the end of the month. I can live there for the first 29 days. On the 30th day, I have to pay for the previous 30 days. That's how schirus works in halacha. So if you're besoch zmano tanina, we already know that halacha. And ila achar zmano tanina, and if you're after the zman, then we also know that halacha too. And we're going to see it from a completely other space in the world, which is the mitzvah pidyon haben, but in a very sad case, it's not. The Mishnah writes. This Mishnah can be found in Maseches Bechoros. Meis ha'ab, a father has an obligation to circumcise his son, to get him married, teach him how to swim, a whole bunch of things. He also has to be podeh his son. That's only true if both are Yisraelim, if it's the firstborn son, if there's no miscarriages, v'chule, v'chule. I married a Levi, I married a Bas Levi, so it never happened by me, and they're somewhat rare, but it happens. Anyways, the Gemara says, if the father, who has the obligation to perform the mitzvah of Pidyon Haben, if the father Nebuch passes away during the first 30 days, so then Bechezkas Shelo Nifte, we have to assume that the child had no Pidyon Haben, unless we find the paperwork. So I've done Pidyon Haben before for people I didn't even think about the paperwork. Ataka should give them something. I should write it down somewhere. I should write down that we did a Pidyon Haben. These people are not from, they're never going to remember. I have had people call me, this happened to me 2 weeks ago. Do you remember my son's name? And no, I don't. I mean, I'm not surprised by it. It happens. I'm like, go look in our text messages. I got to keep a field in my CRM now just to write in the name. It's a big problem. Okay, so somebody asked me if the name Rudolph is a Hebrew name. Can I name my son Rudolph? Resh Vav Daled Lamed Fe. I'm like, no. Go find another name. So if the father dies in the first 30 days, we assume the kid did not have a pidyon haben. And la'achar shloshim yom, if the father died after the 30-day mark, b'chezkas shenifte, we assume the child did have a pidyon haben ad sheyamru lo shelo nifte. And the halachos, the alignment of our assumptions by pidyon haben is the same as our halachic assumptions by paying rent. If you're within the 30 days, you're fine. You're fine. We assume X. If you're outside of the 30 days, we assume Y. So therefore, says the Gemara, what was the question of Rav Yanai? Says the Gemara, Lo tzricha biyomi demishalim zamane. We want to know if the payment was done on the 30th day itself, on that final day of the rental. Mi avid inish Depara b'yom demishalim zimane. Ola. Do we assume that they have to pay on the day that they're chayiv to pay? Yes or no? That was the question of him, and therefore, if the socher says I paid and the landlord says I didn't pay, who now has a burden to bring a raya? Not Stam. If it's day 15, we don't have to assume that anybody paid because ein l'schiris ela levasaf, I don't need to pay yet. That's fine. So it says the Gemara on the bottom line of Kuf Beis Amid Beis. Amar lahu Rabbi Yochanan Tani Tuha. We've already learned this in a brisa. Turning to the top of Kuf Gem Lamed Al Sachir Bizmano Nishba Benoto. When it's the zman for the sachir, for the renter to pay, he is allowed to make a shvua. This is really talking about a worker. The sachir is allowed to make a shvua and pay. And says the Gemara, well, let's see how this works out. Sachir hu de ramu rabbanan shvua alei. Why? Bishum de balabai tard b'poalim. The reason why the sachir, the worker, was given an upper hand was because the Baal is writing, he's cutting 50 checks for everybody. So he's just confused with a worker. Aval hacha by a socher, who's not a sachir. A socher is a renter, not a worker. Perhaps the rules are different. Socher mehem and b'shvua. Here it's just because the socher is mehem and b'shvua. It's a little bit strange, actually, that we do this, but that is the din, that the socher is allowed to make a shvua and say, I paid. And if he says that, then no more payments transact, and we assume that the payment has been made. Speaking about who do we believe, Kuf Gimel Amud Aleph, 4 lines down. Amar Rava, Amar Rav Nachman. Hi man de oger le besa lechavre leeser shnin. I rent out a property to you for 10 years. V'kasav le shtara, and I gave you a star. And v'amar le, I, the person who rented that property to you, I said Nikitas chamesh shnin, that you've already taken the property for 5 years. So I am trusted with this claim mehemet. Amar le Ravachim yidifta le Ravina elameata. If it's true that we believe the balabas with what he says about the loan. Let's say that I lend out $100 with a star. That half has been paid. Would we say that that is still true? After all, you've implied something in regards to the first case of Oger Le Beis Lechavre that we trust the Balabais. We trust the Balabais here too. The Gemara says, Ravacha, your question has no place here. These two cases are not comparable at all. Hasam shtar leguvainakoi. Over there, in regards to the loan, where you said that osve meazuzi b'shtara, there's a document with which you can collect. In isa de pare, if in fact that something was already paid, then then you should have stamped it with a paid stamp. Or inami michtavale tabra, or you should have written, as Rashi says, a shover, you should have written a receipt. Aval hacha, in our case, where we're talking about a case of the oger le beisa lechavre leeser shnin, where I rent you a house for 10 years, and I, as the homeowner, can tell you that it's been 5. Amar le, hai dechsivi lach shtara. The fact that I wrote you a star was kihechi de lo techazik, so that you don't make a chazaka on my property. That's all that was going on. But there was no date on there, and therefore we trust the bailim, and we don't trust the socher. And then the Gemara says, Amar Rav Nachman, this is such an odd din. Shoal adam betuva la'olam. If you borrow something from someone and it's still in good condition, you can borrow it forever. Take a look at Rashi, a quarter of the way down. Dibra maskil, shol adam betuva la'olam. Imra adam kli lechavero. V'amar hashileni betuva. Lend it to me when it's in good shape. V'amar lehein. Shaul lo la'olam. It's yours. Doesn't mean you can keep it, but you can borrow it whenever you want. Kol zman shu roy lemalacha. As long as you need it, your lawnmower, I ask you to borrow it once. It's the same thing as asking if I can borrow it every Sunday. No problem at all. Tahai betuvo mashmalon kolz manchu tuvo. As long as it's in good shape. I feel machziro chozer v'not lo kishet starich. Even if you give it back, you can always go back and take it again. Fascinating din.
When he says the word betuvo, is that what it means?
It's not how it's framed in the Gemara that way. I see why you're saying that from Rashi, right?
It's not. It's
the Amar Hashileni.
I might lend you my car once because you're desperate, but doesn't mean I want you going by every weekend.
Right. Shoal Adam betuvo la'olam. It's not what the Gemara seems to be saying.
Not what the Gemara sounds.
Yeah. I wonder if it's Hashileni, comma, betuvo. Do you have to actually say something? Don't know. This actually made it into the Shulchan Aruch. This is in Tur Shulchan Aruch, Choshen Mishpat, Siman Shin Mem Aleph Siva. We can look it up afterwards. And Amar Rav Mari Bera de Bas Shmuel, V'hu de Kani Mine. There has to be a kinyan of sorts, which is a very interesting thing, because you're not an owner. You're still a shoah. And Amar Amari Berei de Rabashi Umahadra Le Katya. And if it does break, then you have to stop borrowing it. Then you have to give it back. And it might be Mesa Machmas Malach and your putter, but you can't keep borrowing it once it's broken. That you're not allowed to do. Amar Rava, next. Haimanda Amar Le Lechavre Oshlan Mara Lemir Pakbe Hai Pardesa. I'd like you, my Oshlan, to lend to me a mara, a hoe, some type of gardening tool, so that I can till the soil of the pardes. Pardes is typically an orchard. So then the halacha is Rafik Bey Hahu Pardesa. Because you said Hi Pardesa, this particular orchard, so then you can only work in that orchard. If you said Pardesa Stam in an orchard, not in this orchard, looser language, then Rafik Bey Kol Pardesa Dubai, then you can till the ground with this tool anywhere on the property, no problem at all. If you said Pardisi, my Pardes, so then Rafik Vazil Kol Pardisi, the Islay, Umahadrole Katya. Yeah, no problem at all. But we have to just follow the limits of where you're allowed to do it based on the language of the borrowing. Umahadrole Katya, that if in fact there's any breaks, then you have to give back the item. Halfway down on Kuf Gimel Amid Aleph. Amar Papa Hai Mando Amar Lechavre Oshlan Hai Gargusa. Let's say this guy's getting clever. All of a sudden, we start borrowing the Empire State Building. Can I borrow your well, which has endless amounts of water? He's a clever guy. So Gargusa is a well. I don't know if we've ever seen this word before. Rashi says 2/3 of the way down. Be'er Mayim Chaim Lahashkos Sados. It is what's the English word for it? A spring of some kind. Yeah, but meaning it's Be'er Mayim Chaim. It's flowing water, right? So it's not it doesn't end, whatever it is. Anyways, Vinafla, and then let's say the walls caved in, right? Lo Banila, the borrower cannot rebuild it and still have the same status quo. Clever guy, nice move, but you cannot have status quo. That you cannot do. Gargusa, that was only if it was high Gargusa. What if it was Gargusa in general, just a general well, Vinafla, and then Banila? So these are the differences. If I say to you, David, can I borrow well number 4? And you say, sure, Phil, no problem. Then well number 4 buckles. If I rebuild it, I don't have the same shoel status on well number 4. But if I say to you, David, can I borrow one of your wells? And you say, sure, just pick one. And I pick well number 4, and well number 4 breaks. Then if I fix it, I can maintain my status of shoel. Beg Argusa. What about the whole field that I want to be able to dig a well by you? Then Kari va'azil kama gargusi ba'ar. You're allowed to dig holes everywhere in the property. Adim Yisrael until you find till you hit water. But tzarech lemikna minei in it, and you have to make a kinyan there as well. Otherwise, you would not be allowed to do that. Fascinating. Then I'll have to look this up in Shulchan Aruch later. 2/3 of the way down, the last Mishnah in the parak. Hamaskir bais lechavero v'nofal. If I rent a house from you and the house falls down, chayiv, you have to replace the home for me. Lahamid lo bais. Chayiv lahamid lo bais. Hayakatan lo ya'asenu gadol. In the rebuilding of the house, if it was small, we don't make it big. Gadol lo ya'asenu katan. If it's a big house, we don't make it small. Echad. If it had one room, lo ya'aseh shnaim. Shnaim lo ya'asenu echad. And if it has a different number of bedrooms, we don't do that. Lo yifchos min achalonos. Same number of windows. Lo yosif alein elamidas shnehem. The only way that this works is if both people talk, they have an open dialogue and communication, and then they can make certain changes. Otherwise, we don't do that. The replacement house has to be the replacement house. Just an interesting Rashi. Chayav lahamid lo bais. Rashi says, "Bimeis chiruso." Well, I have no idea what that means. Okay, just food for thought. The Gemara opens 10 lines before the end of the parak. What's the case? If what I rented was house X, a specific house, so then nafal, if it falls azale, that's your loss, and that's just the way things are. Then no one's going to rebuild that. So then if it was by stam, then I should be able to build any house for you. So Amar Reish Lakish, a couple of very dachuk answers. It's a very specific measured house. So even though it wasn't a specific house as it relates to the building number, but I only wanted to rent a house of a certain set of dimensions. That's pashud. Same answer as before, basically. Ask the Gemara, okay, good. That is no different. So says the Gemara as we close out the parak. Aguda denara. The house is a waterfront property. You don't have to rebuild it on the waterfront. I think if anybody owns a waterfront property, they would not feel that way. If somebody knocked down their house and rebuilt it, a mile inland, I don't think they'd be so happy. But nevertheless, the halacha says it that way. Hadran halacha shal Baruch Hashem. We finished the 8th parak of Maseches Bava Metzia. Baruch Hashem, we're getting to the close of this Masechta, another 18 blot or so, maybe a little bit less. Is it 120? Don't even know. It's close. 119. All right, we're getting there. 16 days left. The new we should come back to this daf in 7.5 years. I don't want to skip out on any brachos. Hamekabel sada mechaver. If there's kablanus between me and you work the field and you give me a percentage. Makam shenagu liktor yiktor. If the custom is to harvest by cutting, then that's what you should do. Lach or yakor. If the custom is to uproot the vegetation, you should uproot it. Lach or shacharav yakorosh, to plow it. Whatever it is a kolkim in a gamadina. If we have this kablanus relationship where I'm the worker and you're my partner by ownership, whatever we do by tua, by grains, we do the same thing with straw and with hay. Same, just like we'd have a deal when it comes to wine. As we turn to the top of Kukim Lamed Beis, we also split Bizmor Subakanim, which is speaking about different types of branches. One of the branches, we're talking about the branches of a vine. And the other is talking about the ones that hold up those branches. So the arterial ones at the bottom, the thicker ones, and then the smaller ones that lead to the branches. And both of them would have to be misapik the kanim. We'll see what this means in a little bit. That's what Rashi says on the top. A little cheat code. Rashi says, these are the things that hold up the grapevines. Okay, very good. So says the Gemara, Tana makam shenagu liktzor eno rishai lakor, like we saw in our Mishnah, that if there's a place where the custom is to cut when you're working in the field, so then don't uproot lakor and rishai liktzor. And if it's a place where we uproot, then don't cut. And both of these are opposites, so they're ma'akev one another. You can't just choose to do the opposite of what you agreed to. Liktor and Rishai Lakor. Why is it that when we say you're supposed to cut, that you're not supposed to uproot? Because hi Amar be'ino detispan li'ara. I want my ground to have hay all over it from the word tevin. I want that to be there. So I don't want you to be ma'akir. I just want you to cut it so that it'll stay there and become fertilizer for the ground. The other guy can say that I don't even want to do the akira. So for a whole bunch of reasons, it's possible to say that when it says liksor, therefore you should not be ma'akir. What about the other way? That if it's to be la'akor, it's eno rishai liksor. So why is it that we would not be able to be kotzer? Because hi Amar, but de tinakir oi. What I would really like is for there to be akira. I want everything uprooted from the ground, nothing left in the ground. But hi Amar, the other guy could argue, but tivna, that I really want to have the tevin. Why is it that we say that they both are opposites of one another, both the akira and the ktsira? Says the Gemara, matam kama, just to teach us a matam. Matam liksor eno rishai lakor eno rishai liksor. Why are we so particular? Because mishum d'shnei ma'akvin zez. These are not the same actions, and we're in a partnership together. I can't do against what you want. You can't do against what I want. We're on the same page. That brings us to the two dots about 15 lines down or so. Lachrosh acharav yacharosh. So yes, pshita, that is what we agreed to. Says the Gemara, no. Lo tzricha be'asra de lo menachshi. This is a place where they don't do any weeding. But this particular guy did against the standard. So now that he went against the standard and did the weeding, does he now have to go bichoresh, which was part of the process of tearing down the field? The fact that I did the weeding in the first place was that I wouldn't have to go back and plow afterwards. Now it's easy for you to go pick everything. All the weeds are gone. That if that's something that you wanted to do, you should have said something about it. Don't undershare, overshare when it comes to contracts. Just write it in. Just say what your plan is. Say that you wanted to weed and therefore you don't have to plow. Okay, you didn't say that, then you have to go plow. That's fine, but you can't beat the system. What does that mean? Third of the way down. And we have a Mishnah. We have a Brisa. That when it's customary to rent out a piece of land, that the trees go with it. So then maskir, and then the halacha is that the rental of the trees counts. And in a place where we see that it's not customary to rent trees when you rent ground, so then the trees are not rented. So says the Gemara, let's analyze this. I understand that if it's a place that when you rent a parcel of land, that the trees on it are rented to pshita. So what's the chiddush? Says the Gemara, lo tzricha. What is the case where we need this chiddush? To kule alma yave betilsa. That when I work with you, I'm the one working the ground. I always pay you a third, and I keep 2/3 for myself. and I instead of paying you a third, I paid you a quarter. The fact that I gave you a lower price was because I didn't want you to have the ilanos. I'm the owner. You're the worker. So I only took a quarter, but that's because I wanted you to not take the trees. You have a little bit more cash on hand. You can't break the rules. If the custom in that place was to make a third, then you make a third. You want to change it to say a quarter, and you can't just change things without talking to the person. If the deal is that the Kabbalah always gives the balabas, he gives him a third. The balabas can't say, just give me a quarter and don't touch my trees. You can't do that. That has to be negotiated in advance. And similarly, halfway down, that where a parcel of land is rented out and the trees do not come along, pshita, that should also be obvious. So what's the case over there? The opposite. This might be a locale where paying a quarter is normal to the owner of the property. And he said, I'm actually going to take a third, but don't worry. I want it to be that I'm going to give you some of the trees. Oh, so therefore I'm taking a little bit more cash, but I'm paying you with more trees. Shalom al Yisrael. Says the Gemara, you can't do that without talking. It's not reasonable. Whatever the standards are there. The Gemara says, we said that in the same way that if a kabbalah is working with another person, whatever deals you have with tuah, whatever payments he has to make to the bailam with tuah, he has to do the same thing with tevin and kash with straw and with hay. Amar of Yosef, beBavel nehigu de lo yehive tivna le'arisa. In Bavel, there was a minhag that they would not give tevin to an aris. The tevin, the hay, or the straw would always be the owners. The Ma'inaf Kamina. What would be the halachic practical implications of this? The Gemara says, but below Gamrin and Mine. Yes, some people might be nice and they might give over the tevin, but that's not the standard and that's not the requirement. It's an ayin yafet. Good for you. You're a mensch. You're a spitz mensch. But at the end of the day, that doesn't mean that that's the din. Amar Rav Yosef, Bukhra, Vitafta, Ve'arkavta. These are three levels of dirt that function as a border. Three levels of material that function as borders around a property. So what they would do is they would dig a ditch. So if I dig a ditch on this side and I take the dirt and put it here, so then it's starting to grow. So the bukhra is the lower level, the tafta is the middle level of the wall, and the arkafta is the third. And v'kani dechizra, there are reeds that have thorns in them, the balabais. The reeds have to be put there by the balabais, and the border has to be put there by the balabais. The chizra gufei, but the actual thorns themselves, that's the arisa. That the worker has to put there and not the bailam. Klala de milsa. Here is the general rule. Kol ikar balma de balabais. Anything that is basic security, that's what the balma is a reference to here. That is an obligation of the balabais. Take a look at Rashi. Ikar balma, ikar shmira, she efshar below he. Without having the basics, it's unacceptable. That's the balabais. Nitirusa yiserta, but an extra level of protection, putting the thorns in the wall, de arisa. V'amar Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef said, Mara v'zavila v'davla v'zarnuka. When we are dealing with a hoe, something to shovel with, a hoe or a shovel or a basket or leather, all the needs of the leather, whatever that may mean for that property, that's the balabais. Arisa, avid, be, yeuri. But the aris would be the guy who has to come up with a be yeuri. And a Beyuri is some type of irrigation system. That's what Rashi says over here. On the second of the wide lines, actually end of the first of the wide lines, the long lines, Arisa Avi Beyuri. Rashi says on the next line, Olav Lasos Charitzin, Misvas Nahar Ad Sof HaSadeh. He has to cut into the dirt. He has to cut so that the water will flow to the trees he wants to feed. Last couple little pieces. Keshem Shecholkin Beyain Kacholkin Bezmuros Vekanim. That just like when I have a relationship, if I'm the worker and you're the owner, I give you a percentage of the wine. Same is true by the wood that supports the vines. Kanim mayavi the tayu. What good do the kanim do? So the Gemara says, Amr de Berevyanai kanim hamechulakim shebahem shema'amidim es hagefanim. These are the ones that are used to actually hold up the grapevine, and these things have their value. They're kanim mechulakim sheben. Rashi says mechulakim shenitla klipasan mechasuf halavan shalem. So they're taken out. They're actually used to hold up gifan. V'shnei misapken es hakanim. What does that mean? Lamali matam kama matam shneim cholkin b'kanim. Why is it that both of them have to be splitting the reeds? Mishum d'shnei misapkin es hakanim. They both have to provide. In other words, they're splitting the kanim, these particular kinds of twigs. Baruch Hashem. Okay, let's stop at this Mishnah. We're caught up now. Tomorrow night after midnight, we'll just learn one block. It's not even gonna be what? At midnight, 12 o'clock.
That's all.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I said after.
Wishing you all a beautiful night.